My name is Luna. I'm in my 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe with soft words: reliable, calm, low maintenance. I've worked behind the scenes, built quiet systems that kept households and careers moving, and learned early how to read a room before I ever spoke in it. If you asked people who knew me back then, they would probably say I was steady. Some might say forgettable. Very few would say dangerous. That underestimation is part of why I'm telling this story. On the surface, this is a marriage story. It's about love that slowly changed shape, about words that began to weigh more than actions, and about the moment when a sentence like, "My husband threatened to ruin me if I left," stopped sounding dramatic and started sounding procedural. But this is not a revenge story. It's not about exposing anyone or reliving arguments. It's about what happens after you realize that the person who once promised safety now believes fear is leverage. People often assume stories like this are loud. They imagine screaming fights, broken objects, and explosive exits. That wasn't my experience. What happened to me unfolded quietly, almost politely. It happened in text messages sent late at night, in comments disguised as concern, in jokes made just often enough to land. The harm wasn't theatrical, it was administrative. For a long time, I didn't see myself as someone with power. I saw myself as someone who survived by adapting. I thought strength meant endurance. I thought silence meant peace. What I didn't understand yet was that silence can also be a choice, and choices accumulate. This story follows that accumulation. It moves through the small moments people overlook, the internal recalibrations no one applauds, and the slow shift from fear to clarity. There are no sudden heroes here, no miraculous turns of luck, just attention, documentation, patience, and a decision made without raised voices. I'm sharing this not to warn you away from marriage or to suggest that every conflict hides a threat. I'm sharing it because many of us are taught that justice must be loud to be real. I learned the opposite. I learned that sometimes dignity is reclaimed in increments, and that the most decisive actions can look, from the outside, like nothing at all. If you're here because you felt underestimated, or because someone once mistook your calm for compliance, I hope you listen gently, take what's useful, leave what isn't. And as you listen, I want to ask you one quiet question to hold in the background. Have you ever been so focused on keeping the peace that you didn't notice when it stopped including you? Before anything went wrong, I was the easiest person in the room to forget. That sounds harsher than it felt at the time. Back then, it almost felt like a compliment. I was the one people relied on without needing to check in. The one who remembered birthdays, renewal dates, and passwords. The one who absorbed tension so others didn't have to. In my marriage, I was described as stable. In his family, I was low drama. At work, I was the person who always handled it. No one ever asked how. To my husband, I was efficient. I kept our life running smoothly in ways that were invisible unless they stopped. Bills were paid on time, appointments were scheduled. Social obligations were anticipated before they became stressful. I didn't ask for credit because I didn't think it mattered. I thought partnership meant covering the gaps quietly. To his friends, I was a polite background. I listened more than I spoke. When conversations drifted toward topics I knew well, finances, logistics, planning, I stayed silent unless asked directly. When I was asked, my answers were concise, neutral, and unthreatening. I learned early that people are more comfortable when you don't disrupt their sense of themselves. To my own family, I was the strong one, the one who didn't need help, the one who had chosen well, settled down, built a life that looked orderly from the outside. I didn't correct them. I didn't know how to explain that strength. When performed long enough, can start to feel like erasure. I wasn't unhappy all the time. That's important to say. There were good days, quiet mornings, shared routines, but even in the calm, there was a subtle imbalance in how space was distributed. His opinions landed heavier. His frustrations were treated as urgent. Mine were processed later, if at all. And I adjusted. I adjusted my tone so it wouldn't sound critical. I adjusted my timing so I wouldn't catch him tired or distracted. I adjusted my expectations so disappointment wouldn't show on my face. None of this was demanded outright. That's what made it so easy to justify. There was no single moment I could point to and say, this is where it began. What I didn't realize then was that invisibility is rarely assigned all at once. It's learned through reinforcement, through noticing which versions of yourself are welcomed and which are ignored. through choosing the path of least friction over and over again until it becomes the only path you know how to walk. In group settings, decisions were often made as if I had already agreed. My silence was interpreted as consent. When I did speak up, rarely, carefully, it was met with surprise, sometimes amusement, as if I had broken character. I remember one dinner where someone asked my husband how we managed our finances so well. He answered confidently, outlining strategies I had researched, implemented, and monitored. He spoke for several minutes. No one looked at me. I smiled and nodded, because correcting him would have felt disruptive. On the drive home, I told myself it didn't matter. The outcome was good. Why complicate it? That was my pattern, prioritizing outcome over recognition, peace over presence. Inside, though, something quieter was happening. I was taking notes, not on paper yet, but mentally. Notes about how easily my contributions disappeared once they left my hands. Notes about how calm could be misread as passivity. Notes about how being underestimated created a strange kind of freedom. No one watches closely what they don't consider important. At the time, I didn't frame this as awareness. I framed it as maturity. I told myself I was above ego, that I didn't need validation, that I was choosing harmony. What I couldn't see yet was the cost of always choosing last for myself. I was becoming very good at being necessary and unseen at the same time. And everyone around me seemed comfortable with that arrangement. Everyone except me. The first moment didn't arrive with warning. It didn't feel dangerous. That's why I remember it so clearly now. It was an ordinary evening, one of those nights that barely earn a place in memory. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, half watching something forgettable, phones in our hands. I mentioned casually that I was considering taking a short certification course. Nothing dramatic, just something to deepen a skill I was already using every day. He didn't look up when he responded. "That seems unnecessary," he said, not unkindly, almost bored. "You're already doing fine where you are." The words themselves weren't sharp. If anything, they sounded reassuring, but there was something in the tone, final, dismissive, that landed differently. It wasn't curiosity, it wasn't a concern. It was a closed door presented as advice. I paused, waiting for the follow-up question that never came. Why that course? What made you think of it? Instead, he scrolled, the conversation already over in his mind. I let it go. That was the cut. Small, clean, easy to explain away. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself that not every idea needs encouragement. I told myself that partnership includes pragmatism. But my body remembered it before my mind did. There was a tightening in my chest, a subtle recalibration. I felt myself file the moment away, not as pain, but as information. In the weeks that followed, there were others, comments framed as jokes, suggestions delivered as conclusions. Decisions were discussed as if my agreement were assumed rather than requested. Once, when I disagreed with him in front of someone else, politely, briefly, he laughed and said, "You don't need to worry about that stuff." The room laughed with him. I smiled too. That smile was reflexive, practiced. It arrived before I had time to decide if I meant it. Later that night, I replayed the moment in my head. Not angrily, precisely. I noticed how quickly my perspective had been minimized, how smoothly it had been redirected, how no one had thought to check whether I was joking along or being corrected. That was new. Still, I didn't confront him. I didn't journal. I didn't even label it as disrespect. I labeled it as misalignment, a word that allowed me to stay calm, a word that implied flexibility. Everyone else ignored these moments because they were easy to ignore. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't create scenes. They didn't violate any obvious rules. If I had tried to explain them out loud, they would have sounded trivial. He didn't mean it like that. He's just being practical. You know how he is. I knew all the defenses because I used them myself. What changed quietly was my attention. I started noticing patterns, not emotionally, structurally. I noticed how often my ideas were filtered through his approval before becoming acceptable, how often my independence was praised only when it didn't alter the balance of our lives. I noticed that when I deferred, things stayed smooth. When I asserted, even gently, there was friction, nothing explosive, just enough resistance to make silence feel easier. So I chose silence more often. But silence, when chosen repeatedly, leaves a residue. It settles in the body, it sharpens perception. I became very good at noticing what was said after I spoke, and what was said when I didn't. And somewhere in that noticing, a quiet line was crossed. Not by him alone, but by me too. I stopped asking myself whether something felt fair and started asking whether it was worth addressing. That shift didn't feel like surrender. It felt like efficiency, like maturity. I didn't know yet that I was being trained, not aggressively, but incrementally, to take up less space. And I didn't know that I was training myself at the same time. The first small cut didn't bleed, it didn't scar, but it changed how I moved, how carefully I chose my words, how often did I check the temperature of the room before entering it. Everyone else went on as usual. I did too, but I never forgot that moment on the couch. The way an idea could be dismissed without discussion, the way something important to me could be rendered unnecessary with a single sentence. That was when I learned something I wouldn't fully understand until much later. The most effective forms of control rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as reason. After that first cut, nothing changed, at least not in ways anyone else could see. And that was the problem. The absence of visible damage made it easy to pretend there was none. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an event. Sometimes it arrives as an atmosphere. I began to notice how often my opinions were met with silence rather than disagreement. Not argued against, just absorbed and disregarded. If I suggested something and it wasn't immediately acknowledged, it simply disappeared from the conversation. Later, when the same idea resurfaced from someone else, it was suddenly reasonable. At first, I treated this like a communication issue. Maybe I wasn't being clear, maybe my timing was off, maybe I needed to sound more confident, more decisive. So I adjusted again. I refined my language. I rehearsed points in my head before speaking. I waited for what felt like the right moment. The moments rarely came. When they did, the response was often a subtle redirect. "We'll see. Let's not overthink it. That's probably not necessary right now." Each phrase was small, polite, and defensible. None of them, on their own, qualified as cruelty. Together, they formed a pattern. I started explaining myself preemptively, justifying preferences that didn't require justification, apologizing for bringing things up at all. "It's not a big deal," I would say, before anyone else could. I was just thinking out loud. That sentence became a habit, a way of shrinking my own thoughts before someone else could do it for me. My husband didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to forbid anything. He only needed to express mild disinterest. I would take it from there, trimming my desires to fit the available space. And because there were no explosions, no insults, no ultimatums, I told myself this was normal. Long-term relationships involve compromise. That not every thought needed airtime. That being easy to live with was a virtue. I watched myself become agreeable in ways I hadn't chosen consciously. I declined invitations without checking my calendar first. I deferred decisions that affected me directly. I stopped sharing plans until they were fully formed, less vulnerable to dismissal. Even then, when I did share something important, I framed it carefully, as a suggestion, as a question, as something that could be abandoned without consequence. What disturbed me wasn't just how often I was dismissed, it was how quickly I accepted it. There was a moment, months later, when a friend asked me what I wanted. Not what we were doing, not what made sense, just what I wanted. The question caught me off guard. I remember opening my mouth and realizing I didn't have an answer ready. That scared me more than any argument could have. Still, I didn't confront him. I didn't label the behavior. I normalized it. I told myself I was choosing peace, that I was being mature, that relationships aren't about keeping score. But something subtle was shifting internally. My emotional responses were flattening. I wasn't sad or angry. I was distant, observational. I started noticing my own reactions as if they belonged to someone else. I began keeping my thoughts to myself, not out of fear, but out of a growing sense that sharing them was inefficient. That information, once given, could be reshaped or minimized, and I didn't want to spend energy defending my own interior life. That's when the quiet record-keeping began. Not formally, not yet, but I started remembering exact phrases, the timing of comments, the context in which certain jokes appeared. I wasn't collecting grievances, I was collecting data. I told myself this was temporary. Those things would rebalance. That once the stress passed, once circumstances changed, we'd find our way back to equilibrium. But disrespect, once normalized, doesn't retreat on its own. It settles. It waits to see how much room it's been given. And I had given it plenty. The realization didn't arrive with clarity or resolve. It arrived as fatigue. A quiet exhaustion that came from constantly translating myself into something more acceptable. I was still calm, still reasonable, still cooperative, But I was no longer fully present, and no one seemed to notice the difference. It took time to realize that the role I was playing had never been negotiated. It had been assumed. Somewhere along the way, I became the reliable one, the person who would adapt, the one who didn't complicate plans with preferences, the one whose flexibility was mistaken for agreement. No one sat me down and explained this role to me. It emerged organically, reinforced by repetition, and rewarded with approval. When I fulfilled it, things stayed smooth. When I didn't, there was discomfort. Not anger, not punishment, just a subtle withdrawal. Conversations shortened. Decisions moved forward without me. I learned quickly which version of myself kept the atmosphere calm. That version didn't ask many questions. In my marriage, the division of emotional labor was clear, even if it was never discussed. I was expected to anticipate needs, to manage moods, to smooth over tensions before they became visible. If something went wrong, it was quietly assumed that I would handle it. And I did. Not because I was asked to, but because I had learned that stepping into that space prevented friction. It was easier to take responsibility than to explain why I shouldn't have to. What I didn't realize was how deeply this expectation had settled. When I hesitated, even briefly, there was confusion. Not hostility, confusion, as if I had failed to perform a function. Once, after a long day, I told him I didn't have the energy to talk something through right then. His response wasn't anger. It was a surprise. "You're usually better at this," he said casually, as if emotional availability were a skill I'd failed to execute. That sentence stayed with me. I started to see how often I was described in terms of utility. "You're good at handling things. You're so low maintenance. You don't get worked up like other people." These were meant as compliments. I accepted them as such. But beneath them was an unspoken condition: stay this way. The role didn't allow for messiness, or uncertainty, or visible need. I noticed how quickly concern turned into inconvenience when my feelings required time or attention, how empathy had limits when it interfered with comfort. I learned to present emotions only after I had already processed them, trimmed of sharp edges, easy to digest. Eventually, I stopped presenting them at all. In group dynamics, the pattern was even clearer. I was the note-taker, the planner, the one who remembered what had been decided and followed up later. When something succeeded, it was collective. When something failed, I quietly took responsibility and fixed it. No one questioned this arrangement because it worked. And because I didn't protest, it appeared voluntary. That was the hardest part to confront later. The role persisted because I played it well. I was competent, calm, dependable. I had trained people to expect less noise from me, and they were grateful for it. But inside, I felt myself narrowing. Not collapsing, narrowing. My range of expression shrank, my spontaneity dulled. I began to experience my own life as something I managed rather than inhabited. There was a moment, standing in the kitchen one evening, when I caught my reflection in the window. I remember thinking, not dramatically, not with sadness, I don't know who this version of me is for anymore. That thought didn't lead to confrontation. It led to observation. I started paying attention to how roles are maintained, how people react when you step slightly out of alignment, how quickly they attempt to restore the familiar balance. And I noticed something else, something important. The role I'd been assigned depended entirely on my continued participation. No one was forcing me to play it. They were simply accustomed to me doing so. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me curious. If this role had been built through repetition, what would happen if I changed the pattern, quietly, without announcement? I didn't act on that question yet, but I held on to it. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no breaking point that demanded immediate action. That's what surprised me most when I look back. The moment that changed everything was almost unremarkable. It was a weekday morning. The house was quiet in that particular way. It only is after someone leaves for work. I was standing at the kitchen counter, coffee cooling beside me, scrolling through messages on my phone. Nothing urgent, just the usual threads: family, work, logistics. Then I saw it. A message from my husband was sent the night before, while I was already asleep. It wasn't long, it wasn't angry. It was written in that measured tone people use when they want to sound reasonable while drawing a line. He was frustrated about a conversation we'd had earlier that week, one where I gently pushed back on a decision that affected both of us. In the message, he laid out consequences, not explicitly, not dramatically, just enough to be unmistakable. If I continued creating instability, he would make things difficult. He referenced money, reputation, the messiness of separation, and then, near the end, the sentence that would stay with me long after the rest faded. My husband threatened to ruin me if I left. He didn't use the word ruin, that's my translation, clarified by distance. But the meaning was there, carefully worded, plausibly deniable. A reminder of who had more to lose and who would make sure I did. I didn't feel fear in that moment, not the way I would have expected. I felt still. Something inside me went quiet, not numb, focused. I read the message again, slowly, not to interpret it emotionally, but to understand its structure, the conditional phrasing, the implications, the way it framed control as a concern. And then, without really deciding to, I took a screenshot. That action felt different from anything I'd done before. It wasn't reactive. It wasn't defiant. It was procedural. I named the file with the date. I saved it to a folder I didn't yet have a name for. I didn't confront him. I didn't reply immediately. I made coffee. I went through my morning routine. I noticed how calm my hands were. That scared me a little. Throughout the day, the message echoed. Not emotionally, but analytically. I replayed it not as a personal attack, but as information. A data point that clarified something I had been sensing for months. This wasn't miscommunication. This wasn't stress. This wasn't a rough patch. This was leverage being declared. And leverage, once named, changes the nature of a relationship. I realized then that the safety I thought I had was conditional. That my calm, my cooperation, my flexibility had been part of an unspoken agreement. As long as I stayed within my assigned role, things remained smooth. The moment I stepped outside it, consequences appeared. The shift wasn't in how I saw him. It was how I saw the situation. I stopped asking myself how to fix things and started asking what I needed to understand. What systems were in place? What assumptions were being made? What would happen if those assumptions were challenged? For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that staying might be more dangerous than leaving. Not physically, but psychologically. That erosion over time could do more damage than conflict ever would. That night, when he came home, everything looked the same. We ate dinner, we talked about mundane things. He acted as if the message had been a non-event. I matched his tone perfectly. Inside, though, something fundamental had changed. I no longer saw silence as the default. I saw it as a choice. And choices, unlike habits, can be revised. Before going to bed, I opened a new note on my phone. I wrote the date. I summarized the message in neutral language. I didn't embellish. I didn't vent. I documented. I didn't know what I was preparing for yet. I only knew that clarity had replaced confusion, that the fog I'd been navigating in had lifted just enough for me to see the shape of the terrain. And once you see that shape, you can't unsee it. The shift was quiet, invisible, irreversible. After that morning, my silence changed character. Before, it had been reflexive, an instinct shaped by habit and avoidance. Now it was deliberate. I still spoke kindly. I still participated. But every word I chose to withhold carried intention. I was no longer quiet because I didn't know what to say. I was quiet because I was deciding when it mattered to speak. From the outside, nothing looked different. If anything, I seemed more agreeable than ever. I didn't challenge decisions. I didn't revisit unresolved conversations. I nodded, acknowledged, and moved on. This only confirmed what everyone already believed about me, that I was easygoing, adaptable, unchanged. They mistook composure for compliance. Inside, I was doing something very different. I was listening, not for tone, but for content. Not for emotion, but for implication. I paid attention to what was stated outright and what was implied just beneath the surface. I noticed how often things were framed as inevitable, how frequently we meant him, and how consequences were mentioned casually, as if they were natural weather patterns rather than choices. I didn't argue with those frames. I let them stand. Silence, I discovered, creates space. And in that space, people reveal themselves. He began to talk more. About his frustrations, about his sense of pressure, about how much responsibility he carried. He spoke freely, assuming I was aligned, assuming understanding. I listened without interruption. I asked neutral questions. I let him explain himself fully. That was new. In the past, I might have softened his words, redirected them, reassured him. Now I let them land. I let him hear himself. And in doing so, I learned more than I ever had during our disagreements. I also began paying attention to how my silence was interpreted. When I didn't respond immediately, it was seen as agreement. When I didn't object, it was seen as acceptance. That assumption worked in my favor. It allowed conversations to continue without scrutiny. It allowed information to surface without resistance. I wasn't manipulating anything. I was simply no longer volunteering emotional labor to smooth over discomfort. Privately, I started to organize what I was noticing: dates, phrases, patterns. I kept it factual. I avoided interpretation. I treated my own life like a case study. This wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by precision. What surprised me most was how quickly people relax when they believe you're not a threat. My husband stopped editing himself. He spoke with more certainty about what he could do, what would happen if things went wrong, and how situations usually end for people who make things difficult. Each comment reinforced the same underlying belief. That control was justified if it maintained order. I never challenged that belief out loud. I also noticed something else: how much effort I had previously spent trying to be understood. Once I stopped, the dynamic shifted subtly. I conserved energy. I slept better. I felt less reactive. Silence, when chosen, can be grounding. There were moments when I felt the urge to speak, to correct, to clarify, to defend myself. Those moments passed more quickly than I expected. I reminded myself that I wasn't gathering ammunition. I was gathering clarity, and clarity requires patience. At work, I applied the same restraint. I observed how decisions were made, who documented what assumptions were carried forward without question. I sharpened skills I'd always had but never foregrounded: documentation, process mapping, foresight. None of this drew attention. That was the point. I didn't announce a change. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. I simply stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to manage. People interpreted this as stability, as maturity, as loyalty. They couldn't see that I was quietly stepping out of a role I had never consented to play forever. Silence became my way of opting out, without confrontation, without escalation. It bought me time. It bought me perspective. It allowed the situation to unfold naturally, without my interference. And as it unfolded, something became increasingly clear. The structure I was living inside depended heavily on my continued emotional participation. I was still present, still calm, still cooperative, but I was no longer unarmed. What they never noticed was how much room their certainty gave me. When people believe they understand you, they stop looking closely. They rely on past behavior to predict future action. They assume continuity. That assumption became my greatest advantage, not because I exploited it, but because I no longer disrupted it. I moved through my days exactly as before. Same routines, same tone, same availability. Nothing about me signaled preparation. But preparation was underway. It began with something simple: structure. I stopped trusting memory alone. I created systems, folders, categories, timelines, not out of paranoia, but out of respect for accuracy. If something mattered, it deserved to be recorded clearly. I reviewed old emails, old messages, not to relive them, just to understand their trajectory. I noticed how language shifted over time, how suggestions became expectations, how expectations became consequences, how concern slowly gave way to entitlement. I didn't react to what I found. I logged it. Then I started saving things in real time. Screenshots of messages that felt off. Notes summarizing conversations immediately after they happened. Dates, context, direct quotes when possible. At some point, without ceremony, the messages became evidence. I didn't think of them that way at first. That language came later. But something in me recognized their potential weight. Words, when preserved, don't soften with time. They don't adapt to reinterpretation. They stay exactly as they were. I also educated myself quietly, not through dramatic searches or late-night panic spirals, but methodically. I read about financial structures, about shared assets, about documentation standards, about how narratives are constructed and challenged. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. There was no need. This wasn't about secrecy, it was about containment. I wanted my understanding to mature before I exposed it to opinion. What surprised me was how calm the process felt. There was no adrenaline, no sense of urgency, just focus. Each piece of information reduced uncertainty. Each clarification restored a bit of internal balance. Meanwhile, life continued as usual. My husband remained confident. He spoke as someone who believed the parameters were fixed. He referenced outcomes as inevitabilities. He assumed alignment where there was none. I didn't correct him. At work, I sharpened my professional profile without drawing attention. Updated credentials, expanded responsibilities that increased my autonomy. quietly ensured that my contributions were documented formally, not just remembered informally. None of this was strategic in the cinematic sense. There were no late-night plotting sessions, no rehearsed speeches, just a series of small, rational decisions made with a long view in mind. I learned something important during this phase. Preparation doesn't require certainty about the future. It only requires respect for possibility. I wasn't planning an exit yet. I was planning for clarity, for options, for the ability to choose without panic when the moment arrived, and I paid close attention to how little resistance I encountered, because no one was watching. The version of me they believed in was still intact in their minds, calm, dependable, unlikely to disrupt. That belief acted like camouflage. It allowed me to move freely beneath it. There were moments, small, revealing ones, when I realized how thoroughly I had been underestimated. Casual comments about how I wouldn't handle stress well on my own. Jokes about how I preferred to be taken care of. Statements delivered without malice, but full of assumptions. I noted those too, not because they hurt, but because they clarified how I was perceived. And perception shapes behavior. By the time I realized how extensive my records had become, they formed a coherent picture. Not of cruelty, but of control. Not of villainy, but of entitlement. Seeing that picture didn't make me angry. It made me steady, because once a pattern is clear, it loses its power to confuse you. You stop internalizing it. You stop questioning your reactions. You stop wondering if you're imagining things. You start asking better questions. And quietly, without announcement, I was positioning myself to answer them. No one noticed the shift because it didn't look like resistance. It looked like consistency. They never saw preparation as a possibility, because they never believed I would need it. That assumption stayed with them. I made sure of it. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no surge of triumph, no moment where everything suddenly made sense all at once. It arrived quietly, as clarity usually does. I was sitting alone at my desk one evening, reviewing what I'd collected. Not obsessively, not emotionally, but carefully. Messages, notes, timelines, patterns that now stretched far enough back to show direction, not just incident. And for the first time, I looked at it all as if it didn't belong to me. That distance changed everything. Seen from the outside, the picture was unmistakable. What I had experienced as confusion, self-doubt, and gradual withdrawal was, in structure, something very clear. A progressive narrowing of my agency paired with increasingly explicit reminders of consequence. It wasn't constant. It didn't need to be. Control rarely is. What mattered was that when I asserted myself, however gently, there was pushback framed as concern, practicality, or inevitability. And when I didn't, things stayed calm, predictable, rewarding. The message from that morning, the one that finally broke the fog, wasn't an anomaly. It was the most explicit example of a logic that had been present for a long time. And suddenly, I understood the leverage. Not his, mine. The leverage wasn't about exposing him. It wasn't about proving wrongdoing or assigning labels. It was about credibility, about documentation, about the difference between an accusation and a record. What I had wasn't explosive. It was worse than that. It was consistent. Anyone looking at it wouldn't see a dramatic villain or a helpless victim. They would see a pattern of communication that escalated when autonomy appeared and softened when compliance returned. They would see implied consequences, financial framing, reputational framing, pressure applied without overt threat. They would see intention without theatrics. That's when I realized something important. I didn't need to convince anyone of anything. The materials spoke for themselves. That understanding brought no joy, no relief, just a deep, grounding stillness, the kind that comes when uncertainty finally gives way to reality. I wasn't imagining things. I hadn't been overreacting. I hadn't misunderstood tone or timing. I had been responding appropriately to information I didn't yet have language for. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, letting that settle. This was the private reveal, the moment when the situation stopped being emotionally confusing and became structurally clear, when fear lost its edge because it was no longer abstract. I didn't feel powerful, I felt oriented, and orientation changes behavior. From that moment on, every decision became simpler. Not easier, simpler. I no longer asked whether something was fair. I asked whether it aligned with my values and protected my future self. I didn't rush to act. There was no urgency yet. Knowing you have leverage doesn't mean you deploy it immediately. Sometimes it simply means you stop accepting narratives that depend on your silence. I also understood the responsibility that came with that clarity. Using leverage emotionally would collapse everything back into chaos. Using it prematurely would alert him before I was ready. So I did nothing visible. I continued exactly as before, calm, cooperative, predictable. Internally, though, my posture changed. I stopped bracing. I stopped rehearsing explanations. I stopped imagining worst-case scenarios. Because worst-case scenarios are only terrifying when they're undefined. Now mine were mapped. The private reveal wasn't a turning point anyone else could observe. But it marked the end of something essential. The belief that I was trapped by circumstances rather than constrained by perception. I wasn't trapped. I had been contained. And containment only works as long as you don't know where the edges are. Now I did. I slept deeply that night. Not because things were resolved, but because they were finally intelligible. And when things become intelligible, they lose their ability to dominate you. Clarity has a strange side effect. Once you see the shape of a situation clearly, you're forced to reckon with choice. Not the abstract kind, someday maybe, but the immediate uncomfortable reality that doing nothing is also a decision. I reached that point quietly. There wasn't a deadline, no ultimatum, no moment where circumstances forced my hand. What pressed on me instead was an internal question that refused to stay unanswered. Now that I know, what am I going to do with that knowledge? I laid out the options carefully, almost clinically. I could stay and continue as before, calm, compliant, quietly eroding. That path was familiar, predictable. It came with stability, social approval, and the illusion of safety. But it also required ongoing self-censorship and the acceptance of conditional dignity. I could confront him directly, lay everything on the table, demand accountability. That option carried emotional satisfaction, maybe even momentary relief. But it also carried risk. I knew how quickly narratives shift when power feels threatened. I knew how easily calm could be reframed as instability once it became inconvenient. Or I could prepare to leave. Not dramatically, not reactively, but decisively, on my terms, with foresight rather than urgency. That third option frightened me the least, which is how I knew it was the right one. Leaving didn't mean running. It meant choosing an irreversible path toward autonomy. It meant accepting short-term discomfort in exchange for long-term integrity. It meant trusting the version of myself that had gathered evidence patiently, rather than the version that once believed silence alone could keep me safe. I didn't announce the decision when I made it. I didn't even frame it emotionally. I treated it as a strategic pivot, one that required care, timing, and restraint. The most important part of that decision was this: I would not threaten, negotiate, or explain myself prematurely. I had learned through observation that explanations were treated as openings, that negotiations were treated as contests, that emotional appeals were reinterpreted as instability. So I opted out of that terrain entirely. I decided that when the moment came, it would not be a debate. It would be a statement. That choice, quiet, internal, final, changed how I moved through the world. I stopped scanning for reassurance. I stopped wondering how to phrase things correctly. I stopped imagining how I would defend myself if challenged. Because I wasn't planning to defend anything. I was planning to exit cleanly. This didn't make me cold. If anything, it made me gentler. I became more patient, more neutral, more composed. I wasn't suppressing emotion. I was conserving it. I also understood something else at that decision point. I didn't need to prove that leaving was justified. Justification is only required when you believe someone else has authority over your choice. I no longer believe that. The decision wasn't fueled by anger or desperation. It was fueled by alignment, by the quiet certainty that staying would require me to become someone I didn't respect, while leaving would require courage, but only once. After that, everything I did had direction. I didn't rush. I didn't hint. I didn't test reactions. I simply began moving toward independence with the same calm consistency I'd once used to maintain the marriage. The irony didn't escape me. What I had been praised for, my steadiness, my patience, my ability to plan, were the very traits that made this possible. They just weren't being used in the service of someone else anymore. The decision point wasn't dramatic, but it was absolute, and once crossed, there was no going back. Not because I was unwilling, but because I was finally unwilling to betray myself again. Once the decision was made, urgency disappeared. That might sound counterintuitive, but it was true. Panic belongs to uncertainty. Direction brings calm. I wasn't rushing toward freedom. I was walking toward it deliberately, making sure every step landed where I intended. I moved in silence, not out of fear, but out of respect for the process. The first thing I did was separate emotion from action. I created lists, not of grievances, but of logistics, accounts, documents, timelines, dependencies. I treated my life like a system that needed to be carefully disengaged, component by component. Nothing flashy, nothing sudden. I gathered copies of important records and stored them securely. I ensured I had access to everything I needed without raising suspicion. I updated passwords slowly, blending the changes into routine maintenance. I avoided any behavior that might signal a shift in intention. From the outside, I was still the same person. At work, I positioned myself quietly. I confirmed my standing, strengthened professional relationships, made sure my contributions were visible in formal channels, not just assumed in conversation. I didn't announce ambition. I documented competence. At home, I remained consistent. I cooked, I listened, I responded neutrally. When conversations drifted toward the future, I stayed vague. Not evasive, just non-committal. I didn't lie. I simply stopped volunteering information that could be used to anticipate or block my next steps. This wasn't manipulation, it was boundary setting ahead of time. What struck me most during this phase was how invisible preparation can be when it doesn't disrupt comfort. No one questioned my calm. No one noticed the quiet rebalancing happening beneath the surface. I also sought advice, but carefully. Not from people who would react emotionally or urge confrontation. From professionals, neutral voices who spoke in facts, not hypotheticals. I asked questions without revealing motives. I listened more than I spoke. Each conversation added clarity, not urgency. The work was slow and methodical. It required patience. It required restraint. There were moments when I wanted to skip ahead, to say something, to test the ground, to confirm what I already knew. I resisted that impulse. I reminded myself that moving in silence wasn't about hiding. It was about choosing the moment when my actions would matter most. During this time, my husband remained confident. He spoke about plans, about expectations, about outcomes he assumed were shared. I didn't contradict him. I didn't affirm them either. My neutrality was interpreted as agreement. That assumption did a lot of work for me. As weeks passed, I felt something unfamiliar. Steadiness without suppression. I wasn't bracing myself emotionally. I wasn't rehearsing arguments in my head. I wasn't scanning for danger. I was focused. The preparation phase taught me something profound. Independence is rarely claimed in a single act. It's assembled through dozens of small, unremarkable decisions made consistently over time. None of those decisions looked like rebellion. They looked like maintenance. By the time everything was in place, there was no dramatic countdown, no final checklist, just a sense of readiness. Not excitement, not fear. Readiness. And when you reach that point, silence stops being a tactic and becomes simply the absence of noise before change. The consequences didn't begin with an argument. They began with absence, not the obvious kind, no empty rooms, no packed bags yet, but the subtler kind. The absence of emotional cushioning, the absence of automatic availability, the absence of the invisible work I had always done to keep things smooth. At first, no one could quite name what felt different. Plans started to require follow-up. Small oversights went uncorrected. Conversations ended without resolution because I no longer stepped in to provide it. I didn't withdraw dramatically. I simply stopped compensating. The system began to creak. My husband noticed first, though not consciously. He became slightly more irritable, slightly less certain. He asked questions he'd never asked before, not out of curiosity, but out of disorientation. Did you handle that? Didn't you already take care of this? I thought you were on top of it. Each question revealed an assumption that had gone unexamined for years. I answered honestly, calmly, without defensiveness. No, I didn't. I wasn't aware that was my responsibility. I didn't agree to that. These weren't confrontations. They were corrections, small ones, delivered without emotion. And because there was no drama to attach to them, they landed harder than any argument ever had. The imbalance began to surface. At work, something similar happened. When I stopped anticipating needs that weren't formally assigned to me, processes slowed. People had to ask questions instead of assuming answers. Meetings required clarity instead of shorthand. No one accused me of underperforming. In fact, everything I did was still done well, often better than before. But the extras were gone. The invisible glue that held things together had quietly dissolved, and people felt it. What fascinated me was how quickly discomfort turned into confusion rather than accountability. Instead of recognizing how much I had been carrying, people searched for external explanations. Things felt harder, less fluid, less predictable. No one connected that to me, not yet. At home, the shift was more personal. He began to sense that something wasn't aligning the way it used to. He tried to reestablish familiarity through tone, casual jokes, shared memories, references to how we usually do things. I didn't reject these attempts. I didn't lean into them either. I stayed present, but no longer pliable. This unsettled him more than anger would have. Anger he knew how to respond to. Neutrality offered no foothold. There was a moment when he asked me directly if something was wrong. The question sounded sincere, concerned even. I considered my response carefully. "I'm just taking things one step at a time," I said, which was true. Trying to be more intentional. He nodded, unsatisfied but unable to argue with that. The consequences continued to ripple outward. Not as punishment, but as exposure. When a structure relies heavily on one person's unacknowledged labor, its fragility becomes apparent the moment that labor is withdrawn. I didn't announce my withdrawal. I let it be discovered. And discovery is uncomfortable. People don't like realizing how much they've been leaning on something they never fully acknowledged. It forces reflection, or defensiveness, sometimes both. I watched these reactions without judgment, without satisfaction, just observation. This phase wasn't about watching others struggle. It was about confirming something for myself. That my presence had been essential in ways that were only visible once it was no longer compensating for imbalance. The consequences weren't loud. They didn't escalate quickly. They accumulated. A missed detail here, a delayed decision there, a growing sense that things weren't quite as effortless as they once were. And still, no one understood why, because the change hadn't been announced. It had been enacted. Quietly, by the time panic appeared, the window for repair had already closed. That's something people misunderstand about moments like this. They imagine there's a point where concern turns into action, where apologies arrive just in time to reverse damage. But reversal requires early recognition. What arrived instead was confusion, followed by urgency, without understanding. My husband began to sense that something foundational was shifting, not because I announced it, but because the old strategies stopped working. Reassurance didn't restore balance. Humor didn't soften the edges. Mild pressure didn't produce compliance. The tools he had relied on were suddenly ineffective. He started asking questions more often, circling the same topics from different angles. "You seem distant. I feel like we're not on the same page. Things feel off lately." Each statement carried an implicit request. Return to who you were. I listened. I acknowledged. I didn't correct his interpretation, but I didn't validate it either. "I hear you," I said. "I understand that it feels different. I'm thinking carefully about what I need right now." Those responses frustrated him more than silence ever had. They were calm, reasonable, and immovable. There was nothing to push against. That's when the tone shifted. Not to anger, not yet, but to urgency. He started trying to fix things retroactively, offering compromises, suggesting conversations, reframing past behavior as misunderstandings. The timing was telling. What he was responding to wasn't my pain. It was the loss of predictability. The realization that the dynamic he depended on was no longer reliable. He hadn't noticed the erosion when it was gradual. He noticed it when it affected him. There was one conversation, quiet, late at night, where he said something that clarified everything for me. "I don't know why you didn't say something sooner," he said. "We could have worked on this." I remember looking at him, not with anger, but with something closer to sadness. Not for myself, but for the gap between perception and reality. I had said something, many times, softly, carefully, in ways that were easy to dismiss. What he meant was, "Why didn't you say it loudly enough to disrupt my comfort?" I didn't argue the point. I didn't list examples. I didn't revisit old conversations. Doing so would have turned the moment into a debate, and debate was no longer the goal. Instead, I said, "I did the best I could with what I understood at the time." That was the truth. The panic grew when he realized I wasn't returning to the familiar role. When reassurance failed to reestablish control, he reached for authority, subtle reminders of shared history, of obligations, of the difficulty of change. It didn't work, because by then, I wasn't deciding whether to stay. I had already decided to leave. What he was experiencing wasn't negotiation. It was delay catching up to reality. And delay always loses. The irony was that had these conversations happened earlier, before leverage was declared, before autonomy was framed as a threat, they might have mattered, but timing is everything. Concern offered after consequences emerge rarely lands as care. It lands as preservation. I felt no triumph watching this unfold. No vindication, just a quiet confirmation that the decision I'd made wasn't reactive, it was necessary. The moment for fixing things had passed. Not because I was unwilling, but because trust requires safety. And safety can't be restored through urgency alone. By the time he realized how serious I was, the structures were already in motion. The systems disengaged. The future is no longer dependent on negotiation. What he experienced as sudden was, for me, the result of months of clarity, and clarity doesn't reverse itself. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was quieter than anyone would expect. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no emotional release that movies promise will make everything make sense. It took place at the kitchen table on an ordinary evening, with nothing dramatic in the air. That ordinariness mattered. It stripped the moment of spectacle. I told him I was leaving, not thinking about it, not needing space, leaving. I didn't list reasons. I didn't narrate my pain. I didn't frame it as a reaction to his behavior. I framed it as a decision about my life. He stared at me for a long moment, as if waiting for the rest of the sentence. When it didn't come, he tried to supply it himself. Is this because of that argument? Are you overwhelmed? We can fix this. Each question assumed the same thing, that this was a momentary deviation, not a conclusion. I shook my head gently. This isn't something to fix. That was when his tone changed, not to rage, but to control. He reminded me of practical realities, finances, reputation, the inconvenience of separation, the complications. He said them carefully, as if laying out facts. I listened. Then I said evenly, I'm aware of all of that. What I didn't say was that I was aware because I had already accounted for it. When he realized persuasion wasn't working, he tried something else. He referenced loyalty, history, the years we'd invested, the version of me he believed in, the one who endured. That version didn't answer. Instead, I told him what would happen next, not as a threat, as a sequence. I'll be moving out on this date. Our communication will be in writing. Logistics can go through the appropriate channels. Each sentence was short, neutral, complete. He asked if I was angry. I'm clear, I said. That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. Anger implies volatility. Clarity implies permanence. There was a moment, brief, revealing, when he looked at me and said, You're being very cold. I considered that. I'm being careful, I replied. There's a difference. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend my tone. I didn't soften my words to make them easier to hear. I spoke the way I had learned to speak when accuracy mattered. He searched my face for something, fear, doubt, emotion he could engage with. He didn't find it. What he didn't understand was that the emotional processing had already happened, months earlier, in private. What remained now was execution. The conversation ended without resolution because resolution was no longer a shared goal. There was nothing to negotiate. When I stood up from the table, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because the confrontation was over, but because it had finally matched the scale of what I had been preparing for. No escalation, no collapse, just truth delivered without heat. And that, I learned, can be the most disarming form of confrontation there is. After I left, people expected me to be different in obvious ways. They expected anger, or grief, or a dramatic reinvention. Some waited for a collapse. Others waited for a victory lap. What they didn't expect was continuity. I didn't become louder. I didn't become bitter. I didn't turn my story into a cautionary performance. What changed was internal. For a long time, my identity had been built around stability. For others, I was the person who absorbed uncertainty, so it didn't spread. The one who stayed calm, so systems could function. Leaving didn't erase that part of me. It repurposed it. Now my steadiness belongs to me. I live more simply, not because I have less, but because I no longer manage excess that isn't mine. My days are quieter. My decisions are smaller and more deliberate. I notice how much mental space opens up when you're no longer bracing for someone else's reactions. I trust myself in ways I didn't before, not because I've become fearless, but because I've proven I can act with clarity even when it's uncomfortable. What surprises me most is how little I feel the need to explain. I don't justify my choices to people who weren't inside them. I don't correct every misconception. I don't defend my calm. I let others hold their interpretations because I no longer need agreement to feel grounded. That's new. I've also redefined what strength means to me. It's not endurance. It's not silence. It's not adaptability at the expense of self. Strength, I've learned, is the ability to recognize when a system is harming you and to disengage without theatrics. There are moments when I think about the version of myself who stayed quiet for so long, I don't judge her. She did what she needed to do with the information she had. She learned how to survive in a space that didn't make room for her fully. I honor her by not repeating her mistakes. I also recognize now how easily calm can be misinterpreted. How often people assume that composure means compliance, or that patience means passivity. I don't rush to correct those assumptions anymore. Sometimes letting people underestimate you is a gift. The difference now is that I'm aware of it. And awareness turns misinterpretation into choice. I still value peace. I still speak carefully. But I no longer confuse peace with self-erasure. I know where my edges are. I know what I will and won't absorb. And I don't need to threaten, explain, or prove anything to maintain them. If there's one thing I carry forward, it's this. Clarity is cumulative. It builds quietly through attention and honesty until one day it becomes undeniable. Who I am now isn't a reaction to what happened. It's a continuation, one that finally includes me. There's a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to offer a lesson wrapped in certainty. To say this is what you should do or this is how it ends. I don't believe in that kind of conclusion. Lives are too specific. Context matters too much. What I can offer is perspective. For a long time, I believed that staying calm was the same as staying safe. That if I spoke gently enough, adapted quickly enough, absorbed enough discomfort quietly, everything would stabilize. What I learned is that calm can coexist with harm, and that silence, when it's not chosen freely, slowly teaches others what you'll tolerate. The moment that changed everything for me wasn't when someone crossed a line loudly. It was then that I realized that fear had been introduced as a management tool, when autonomy was framed as a threat, when consequences were implied not to protect a relationship, but to preserve control. That's when preparation replaced hope. Not preparation for revenge, not preparation for exposure, preparation for choice. I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because clarity made staying dishonest. I left because I understood that dignity doesn't require permission and safety doesn't come from compliance. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Pay attention to what happens when you assert yourself calmly. Notice whether curiosity meets you or resistance. Notice whether concern expands your options or narrows them. And most importantly, notice how often you're asked to explain yourself when someone else feels uncomfortable. The quietest warning signs are the ones that sound reasonable. I'm not here to tell you that silence is wrong. Sometimes silence is wisdom. Sometimes it's rest. Sometimes it's protection. But silence that costs you your sense of self is not peace. It's postponement. You don't owe anyone your shrinking. You also don't owe the world a dramatic ending. Change can be quiet. Departure can be calm. Justice can unfold without spectacle. I'm living proof that you can reclaim your life without raising your voice. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop participating in a dynamic that depends on your silence to survive. If this story resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in any part of it, I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever reached a moment where clarity arrived quietly and you realized you couldn't go back to who you were before? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them more closely than you might think.